Yeah, I've seen organizations like that, and they're really quite mediocre. And you look at some of the great organizations in the world, and what you can see is a defined culture. But I think beyond talking about culture, I think I'm a big fan of the historian Yuval Harari, and he talks about uh, culture going back to prehistoric times being tied to storytelling and the values that we create for our society. They all come down to the stories we tell and reinforce.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation.
And today our guest is Norman Bacal. Hi, Norman.
Judith, hi, how are you?
I'm cool. What about you?
It's just lovely here, although it's quite cold.
Yeah, that's always a problem. Norman, tell us about you.
Well, I am now in the process of proceeding with my second career. My first was as a lawyer, in fact, as a tax lawyer, which actually sounds a bit boring. But I spent most of my career doing two things. One was financing movies and television shows in Hollywood, in the UK, pretty much all over the world. I also built a law firm, and that's a long story, but I won't go through that yet in the introduction. And I retired from all that about 7 years ago and began to write. Did a little bit of business consulting as well, but mostly I write books for young professionals. I've done a memoir, and I've also written a couple of mysteries.
That is quite a change from being a lawyer.
Tell me about it.
What made you make the change?
Well, it was an interesting, it appeared to be a somewhat sad story to start. The firm that I had built and grown over the last 25 years of my career collapsed about a year after I stepped away from management. And literally, it was known in the Canadian press as the greatest failure in Canadian law firm history.
Oh.
So yes, so I was attached to that, and it was I think my career went from being this fairly successful endeavor to being suddenly associated with a huge business collapse, and of course the process of going through that for the final year of my legal career. And a couple of years later, I decided I'd had enough because what had thrilled me and excited me for almost 35 years was no longer fun. And it was my wife who handed a notebook to me, one of these empty notebooks, the kind you're meant to write in as a journal. And she said, "Why don't you start recording your feelings?" Because I was walking around. I guess I was fairly angry and not admitting it, because when you watch everything you've built collapse around you, I think there's a lot to deal with. There's a lot of loss to deal with. So I began writing, and I wasn't sure where to start. So I just began with how the last day, I felt like the captain going down with the ship at the law firm on its final day of existence. And I wrote what that felt like the bleakness of sitting in empty office spaces with everyone gone and no support staff left anymore, and recycling boxes filling up the hallways and pretty much nothing else. So it was certainly there's a desolation. So I wrote how that felt, and then decided that I didn't know what to do next. So I decided I'd go back to the beginning of my career, just write down every story I could remember, going all the way back to law school. And that turned into a daily habit. So I'd go to work during the days, and at nights I'd sit down and write for 2 or 3 hours. Pretty much it went from 3 days a week to 5 days a week to 7 days a week. And by the end of 6 months, I'd filled up 750 of these blank pages. And you might conclude I had become a little bit obsessive about it. But suddenly I realized I had, at the very least, something to represent 35 years of work, if only something to show my children and hopefully eventually my grandchildren. And then somebody came up to me and said, "Do you think there's a book there?" And of course, I said no, because one of the things I was certain I was never going to do in my life was write a book. But I sent it out to a couple of places, and one agent called me back and said, Norm, I think you might have something there. Apart from anything else, it's a very interesting Canadian story from a business perspective. He said, but I have to confess that he said, how long is it? I said, it's 750 pages. He said, Norm, nobody's that interested in your life. Call me back when it's under 300, which I did. And that begat the second career. So it's a very long answer to a very short question.
No, it's fascinating. What's that book called?
That book is called Breakdown, I think appropriately, but it's really 3 books in one. Book 1 is how you go from being a school student to successful professional or entrepreneur. It's a case study. And book 2 is how you build and lead an organization, and successful tips and what served me well along the way. And book 3 chronicles the failure of the organization and studies the lessons about what is the glue that holds organizations or businesses together, and how easily it can all come apart at the seams.
They sound like a fascinating read, actually. You can get them at Amazon, I take it.
You can get it on Amazon. And it was actually a Canadian bestseller about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think the lessons are eternal. And I took those lessons and began to lecture across Canada and at university campuses, really to students. And the theme of my lecture for the next 5 years was, I used to be you, the student with the long hair and the beard, or the long dress, sitting in the classroom, having no idea of what was ahead of me, and how did I get to be me? And that, when I'd given that speech enough times, I said to myself, there might be another book here. So I sat down to write it.
So is that about, I see here that you talk about slaying the mythical 2-headed Perality beast.
Yes.
What is that? Tell me about that. And what is Perality?
What is Perality? Well, it's a word I invented. The nice thing about becoming an author is you can do whatever you want, and if people don't like it, they just don't have to buy it. So, but I like to invent new words. So this is based on, this comes out of my second book, which is Take Charge, which is literally, it's a book based on my lectures. It's for young professionals or entrepreneurs who are starting up, and it contains all the lessons no one is teaching you in school that you need in order to survive, whether it's business lessons or street smarts or skills you can learn. But the most important skills that I talk about begin with sales and service. And it doesn't really matter what you go into, whether you're in business, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a professional. Most of us at one point or another are going to serve others. And the most important lesson that I believe you need to learn, and the one that took me a long time to learn, had to do with our basic life experience. And that is, we tend to see our life, and not just from a business perspective, but everything we do, everything we go through is based on our reality, or at least our perception of reality. And when we're serving others, the point I try and drive home is that our reality doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is their reality. When you're trying to serve someone else, whether you're a waiter at a restaurant, or you want to be their lawyer or accountant, or whether you want to sell them a product, what you do, what you believe, what you think doesn't matter. All that matters is what that prospective client or what that other person in your life believes and sees as reality. So there's my perception and there's your perception, and all that matters to you is your perception and your reality. And where the Perality beast comes out is, and I'll give you a simple example. And it's something I learned early in my career, and I promised something to a client for 5 o'clock on a Thursday. And at about 3 o'clock on Thursday, it just wasn't ready. But I knew if I worked all night on it, I could have it ready at 9 o'clock. It would be the best thing I ever sent to them, which is what I did. And I was a little too embarrassed to call and say anything in advance. So I delivered at 9 o'clock. What's the difference? And the next morning I sent it, and I hadn't slept all night, and I thought it was fantastic. They got it. And that afternoon I got a call from the client, really upset. And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't get it. Like, this is the best piece of work I have ever delivered. Why are you upset? And the simple answer was that I had set their perception that I was going to deliver it at 5 o'clock the day before. And when I missed that deadline, they got upset. So the fact that I killed myself working, that I did all this, that I was doing this all for them. Like, I put you first. Literally, I left my whole life behind. That was my perception. And that was completely irrelevant. All that mattered was their reality. And when you're serving others, or where you're dealing with others, you have to get into their heads. You have to understand what they want. You have to meet their perceptions. And what you think, what you do doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it?
It sure is. Nobody cares how hard you're working. All they care is you said you'd have it here at 5. And I can tell you, if I promised it at 5 and delivered it at 4, they think I was a hero.
Also, there's something there about speaking up when you know, rather than just hoping that you can get forgiveness afterwards.
Exactly, which actually I deal with in the entire center of Take Charge, which is my second book. And that has to do with the root of all problems in our life is bad communication, or fear to deal with what you're not prepared to admit. And so we hold it back. We figure we'll deal with it later. And when we finally deal with it, the other person's perception is, they're ready to kill us, instead of recognize how much we care about them in terms of trying to deal with it our way. But if we just, if you just picked up the phone well before the deadline and said, listen, I'm working on this very hard for you, but I'm at a crossroads. And you have a choice. I can deliver you something. I can deliver you, as I call it, the Volkswagen Beetle for 5 today, like I promised. But if you want the Cadillac, if you want the best piece of work I'm capable of delivering, it's going to take me 12 more hours. You decide. What do you want? And when you put the power in the other person's hand by making that simple communication, you've completely changed the perception and the reality. And it sounds so simple when I say it, and yet I managed professionals for 25 years, and I understand just how hard it is for people to make those simple kind of admissions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's surprising when that lesson hits. I remember years and years and years ago, I just joined a company as head of HR. And in the first week, it was payroll week. And I remember, I think the payroll was meant to be run on the Friday. And I remember it was something like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was in the payroll office, and I sort of said, how's it all going? And then the payroll manager very casually said, I don't think we'll make payroll today. And then carried on. I was like, sorry, what did you say? And, we're not going to make it, but it's all right. We'll get it done by Tuesday. I was like, are you telling me you're not going to pay anybody today? And they're like, no, we haven't got round to it. And I was like, And it was, they had just such a lack of, they just wasn't bothered. And they said, it's okay, because we can just pay, we can just, because of the business, they're like, we can just do like loans, and we can, get money into the account by the Saturday or something. And it was just like, how often does this happen? And like, yeah, all the time. And I'm like, not anymore. It was such a no deal. And they couldn't comprehend that people had like mortgages to pay, and things had to be out. If you say you're going to pay somebody on such a day, that's the day you pay them.
Yes.
And it was just fascinating that they really didn't see it as a problem.
And that itself is a problem. And I'm sure as a leader, you change that in terms of how they behave.
Did not happen again.
Well, exactly.
But yeah, it was absolutely fascinating, as to say, the casuality of that. So you talk a lot about psychology and using it to succeed, and I'm curious about how does the average leader do that?
I think you have to, if you're going to lead, you have to understand that whatever your values are, or whatever values you want your organizational people to have, they have to see in you. So, and I like to tell an anecdote, and it's because it's a true story. But so I was I started out as a leader of a firm of about 300 people when I took over the job. And by the time I retired from the job, we were about 1,100 in about 10 offices across the country. And we had offices in Paris and elsewhere. But I used to come to work in the morning, and I'd walk through the reception area, and I had a little joke with the receptionist. And I'd look at her as I walked in the door, and I'd say, "Do you know who the most important person in this organization is?" And she'd look at me and smile. And I'd look back at her, and I'd say, no, it's not me. And she looked at me quizzically. "Well, who is it?" I said, "It's you." And she started laughing. I said, no, I'm serious. Let me explain it to you. I said, "You are the person who meets and greets everyone as they come through the door. You're the person that answers the phone when they call the firm. Even when they're calling for me, you're the first person they're going to speak to. You're the first person they're going to see. And if you give them a good impression from the moment you meet, you make my job 100 times easier, because they will have a feeling about this organization that, wow, they really care about me." And why that was important was, I think there was one principal reason, but there were really two. One, she understood how much I trusted her to do the job. And second, she carried herself with a whole new confidence after I spoke to her. And she suddenly understood the responsibility that she had. And she also understood that she wasn't just a little cog in a big wheel, but she was a key part of an organization. And if, as a leader, you can find the door opener to every one of the people who work for you, whether it's directly or indirectly through your leadership team. But if you can create that impact on the people around you, you're going to have your organization performing at a level that's far higher than anything you can imagine.
Let's listen to a quick advert.
The Maverick Paradox. Judith Germain is an author, speaker, consultant, mentor and trainer, and the leading authority on Maverick leadership. She is the founder of the Maverick Paradox, which supports organizations to enhance their leadership capabilities and to help business owners develop and grow their businesses. Judith enables individuals, business owners, and organizations to improve their impact and influence. She is also HR Zone's leadership columnist, and her expert opinion has appeared in national, international, and trade press.
Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious.
When I work with organisations around culture, it's so abundantly clear that there's a misunderstanding of how culture is derived, thinking that somehow the organisation somehow just creates it out of nothingness. Like, we have this organisational culture and it's come from, I don't know, our policies. And it's like, no, your organisational culture supports the collective leadership culture that has derived from an individual culture, and it's driven by how the leaders act and empower and their attitudes and things like that, and their perceptions and how they see their reality. And all of that then trickles down into how the customer feels it, how the customer picks up this collective leadership culture. But it does fascinate me that, some organisations really think that it's culture is something nebulous that you can't you can't control in a way. You can't predict how it's going to happen or even how to create it.
Yeah, I've seen organizations like that, and they're really quite mediocre. I mean, they may continue on at whatever pace they're continuing, but they're never going to be industry leaders because they just sort of struggle on. And you look at some of the great organizations in the world, and what you can see is a defined culture. But I think beyond talking about culture, I think I'm a big fan of the historian Yuval Harari. And if people haven't heard of him, he's the guy who's written *Sapiens*, which is like a world bestseller, and *Homo Deus* and a number of other books. And he talks about culture going back to prehistoric times being tied to storytelling, and the values that we create for our society, whether they're based on truth or mythology, all come down to the stories we tell and reinforce. And I was always a big believer that if I could tell a story, so for example, the one I told before about our receptionist, but if I could tell stories that reinforced the values that we believed in, people would begin to get it. Mm-hmm. So it's not just nobody really cares about how well we did this year or what the financial performance was compared to last year, but but everyone takes note when you point out. And I can remember one holiday party where I pointed out to one of our assistants who'd been there for years, and I said, if you want to find a real hero here, Linda at the table over there is one of our heroes. I said, because she's been through a bout of cancer, and she's fought her way back, and she's here, and she's always got a smile on her face. And I think the impact that has, not so much on Linda, but on everyone else around her, is critical. But if you come and you put a smile on your face and you work through your own adversity for the betterment of everybody else in the organization, A, it's going to get noticed. B, you're going to get called out in front of everyone. And who doesn't want that?
Well, I'd imagine there's some introverts out there listening, having a heart attack, thinking about being called out in front of them.
I can tell you all those, and it may be hard to believe, but I'm an introvert as well. But as much as it may be hard, sometimes it may be hard on the person getting the recognition when they're getting it. But it's not just about them; it's about everyone else in the room. I used to do this ceremony for all our employees at 5 years, at 10 years, at 15 years, at 20 years, and when I took it over, it was just sort of you'd hand out a certificate, and that would be it. But I took those moments to make little speeches about those people as I handed them out, and I made it my business to learn something about them. So, here's the leader of the organization who's got 1,000 decisions to make every week, and who's traveling around the country and sometimes around the world, going to visit all the offices. But that leader has gone out of his or her way to find out something about an employee who's been there for 5 years or for 10 years. It says something not only to the employee, but it says something to everyone else in the room, including the newcomer who's just arrived, who thinks to themselves, wow, I want that for me. And to get that for me, it means I got to stay here 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And if you talk about the things that make workplaces sticky for their employees, that creates the connectivity between the leadership and the employment group, and between them and one another, it's the little things that recognize our shared humanity. Mm-hmm. That really I've always said it's never about money. It's not about paying people more money to stay. Because if people come for more money, they'll leave for more money.
Yeah. It's about, intrinsic rewards are going to last a lot longer than external rewards.
Mhm.
So
That's right.
what is then the secret of harnessing psychology then, the power of psychology? And are there any examples that you can use that we might recognise?
Well, you can. I mean, the one thing that I've discovered is the more you empower people
Mm-hmm.
As a leader, the more they will surprise you with ingenuity that you don't that you couldn't even come up with. I mean, that's the nice thing about empowerment. The notion that the leader is responsible for everything and knows more than everybody is probably the opposite of the culture where you want your organization to blossom. And I think blossoming comes from empowerment of people, letting them succeed. More important, sometimes letting them fail.
Just a tough.
And letting them also see when you fail.
Mm-hmm.
That you're able to pick yourself up and go on. I mean, there's the one thing in terms of psychology, and lawyers are about the worst at it. We score, and I've spoken to some clinical psychologists who have studied thousands and thousands of lawyers. Lawyers, on the whole, while they appear to like conflict, are very non-resilient. We're very brittle as a rule. We don't like criticism. We crumble when we're criticized.
Isn't that the whole thing about the debate and the litigation? Isn't that all about scoring the point and moving? I would have thought lawyers would be quite excited about,
When you're doing it for your client, it's fine. But as soon as it involves you, I can't tell you how many lawyers are crushed by criticism.
Is that because you believe, or they have succeeded because they're the best and they know the law, they know their facts? So is it because that's what makes it brittle, that everything's around that knowledge?
It's hard to know whether the law attracts those kind of personalities. So it's a very blustery exterior, and the rules aren't universal, but on average, from what I gather, we score at the very, very low end of resilience.
Wow.
So as long as things are going well, we're fine. But if somebody comes up and criticizes, and remember the reaction to criticism always, when you're a lawyer, isn't necessarily it's a collapse. It's a rejection of the criticism. No, that just doesn't apply to me. I'm not like that.
Okay.
I do listen. I do take instructions when it's clear that they don't listen at all.
That's very similar to a lot of high-powered technical roles in corporate as well, isn't it? Where being elite and getting the right answer at the right time and at the first time is everything. Like a doctor, as a consultant or something like that. You don't want your doctor to get it wrong, so it's harder for them to admit there's been a mistake, for example.
Yes. And lawyers are the same. And some of them are worse. And again, it's not universal, but certainly it kind of runs amok. So, which leads to, from a psychology perspective, it's sort of how, from a leader, it's the greatest challenge is always, how do you get the most out of everybody? It's like I have 4 children. They're all grown up now, but what works with one child won't necessarily work with the other.
That's annoying, isn't it?
Well, it's the same when you're a leader. You have to figure out, what the successful leader will figure out what motivates you best, and how do I tailor the motivation that I give to you in a way that suits your personality.
Oh yeah, what that just strikes me. You're right, because good leaders, great leaders, personify their leadership, but average leaders try to find some sort of generic response that hits most people. And, you know, if it doesn't happen to motivate you, that's a bit sad, but that's not their fault, because, you know, you should be like, you know, the 80% on the bell curve.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think there's the one, if somebody asks me, what's the one most important skill you need to cultivate it as a leader? And certainly if you were a lawyer, you'd think, oh, it's your oration skills. It's how you convince people. It's how you convince a judge or a jury or the other party in a negotiation. And I'm suggesting it's actually the opposite. It isn't about how well you speak or communicate. It's about how well you listen. And not just to the words coming out of people's mouths, but to the cues, the body language. You know, it's not about what they're saying, but what is it they mean? And if you're not, you know, if you haven't cultivated the ability to listen well, then it just flies right over your head. And if you do listen well, then you can read the cues, and you can feed back. The feedback you give to the person you're trying to direct will be tailored to what you hear from them. Because as soon as you start listening, you're showing them you actually care about them, and that's half the battle. So if instead of me, you know, how often is it that we're in a discussion or argument, you're speaking, and the only thing I'm thinking about is what my response is going to be next. Like how do I rebut that? How do I contradict you? How do I convince you I'm right? When I would get 100 miles ahead of, or kilometers, I should say, or whatever system you use, but I'd be so far ahead if I just said to myself, okay, what's that person really going through? And how do I connect with what they're going through? Because if I can do that, if I can understand what's motivating you or what's holding you back, then I can unlock you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember working for an organisation a few years ago and having to do my first pay negotiation with the unions, and everybody was saying, oh, this is going to take weeks and they're going to kill you because they're really anti everything. And I must admit, I was a bit worried. Anyway, but I had really got to know a number of the union negotiators through just normal, you know, getting to know the people you work with, you know. And then when we sat down to negotiate and you had all your facts and figures, I kind of cut straight to the chase. It's like, so guys, what do you want? And they were like, sorry. I was like, well, argue. You tell me what you want. I tell you if it's reasonable, and we'll go from there. And they were just looking at me like, this is not how it's normally done.
Well, good for you.
And we just sorted it out, and it was like, I know that you want this and I can't give you that, but I know you need to look good, so what can I give you so you look good? And
right.
You know, it was a real kind of, I understand what you're saying, and you know, and they would like, I want to give you this, and I'm like, okay, because like you're trying to work out a good thing that works for everybody, as opposed to trying to, because you still have to work with the people,
right?
And not only that, they're there to make sure the employees are treated well. And as a leader, isn't that what you're there for too? So you both actually have the same end goal, but you have different ways to get into it.
Right. And you know what? When you think about it in theory, it sounds so complicated, but in practice, if you can just break it down into its small components and start with, I care enough about you to listen to what you have to say, I think you're on the right track. And it's funny because I write, you know, the whole central thesis of Take Charge, which is my second book, is based on that. It's sort of the key communication skills, how you cultivate them, what's important. Because if you can focus on that, I think you're way ahead of, you know, where you'd be if you don't.
Okay, so before we end, is there something I should have asked you, Norman, and I didn't get round to doing it? Because if so, you can talk about it now.
Is there something I haven't asked you? It's funny. I was once asked, "Tell me something about you that would surprise me." And I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that is. Only the only thing I'd add is, and this is on a somewhat sideways note, and that is that it's not always roses when you're a leader.
No.
It's so much of my success when I succeeded was based on prior failure and things that I learned along the way. It's funny because I did a TED talk on it. It's called "Become the Person You Can't Imagine," and it's had about 500,000 views around the world. So I guess it's connecting, but my central point is that your life is a river, your career is a river, and you take the opportunities as they come by, and it's okay to get it wrong. Like I've said it, and it might be trite to say that I've learned way more from my failures than from my successes. And as long as you have the inner strength to pick yourself up, to go on, to understand this happens to everybody at some point or another, and just keep going, and new opportunities will come along as long as you keep growing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Norman.
Oh, it's really been my pleasure. It's been great. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, my website is normanbacal.com. The hardest part of that is spelling it right. The Norman's the easy part. Bacal is Bacal. And normanbacal.com, you can see all my books, and I do some speaking as well. And I respond to any comment or query, regardless of where it comes from or who it comes from. I'll talk to anybody about anything, anytime.
Fantastic. And thank you for those out there listening in to the Maverick Paradox podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my conversation with Norman as much as I enjoyed having it.
The Maverick Paradox magazine. The Maverick Paradox magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.